Good day, everybody. Welcome to the Yale Lectures in Late Antique and Byzantine Art and Architecture. My name is Robert Nelson. I co-direct this series with my colleague, Vasileios Marinis. Our series is supported by the Institute of Sacred Music at Yale, the Department of Classics, and the Department of Art History. Today, we have a double bill, so to speak. We have two speakers in the same time slot, and I will allow my colleague Vasileios Marinis to introduce our speakers. Vasily?
Thank you, Rob. It is my pleasure to welcome you all and also to introduce our two speakers and the respondent. Isabella Sullivan is Assistant Professor and Director of Graduate Studies at the Department of the History of Art and Architecture at Tufts University. She specializes in the artistic production of Eastern Europe and the Byzantine Slavic cultural spheres in the period between the 14th and the 16th centuries. She has published on several topics related to the history and visual culture of medieval Moldavia and their connections with Byzantium and the Latin West in the post-Byzantine period. She is the author of the award-winning book, The Eclectic Visual Culture of Medieval Moldavia, which was published in 2023, and of Europe's Eastern Christian Frontier, which was published in 2024. Through her collaborative efforts, Professor Sullivan aims to bring scholarly and public attention to the northern frontiers of the Byzantine Empire in Eastern Europe, especially after 1453, and we are really grateful for this effort. Our second speaker today is Vladimir Ivanovici, who is a lecturer at the Mendrisio Academy of Architecture. His research focuses on the art and architecture of the eastern half of the Mediterranean between circa 300 and circa 1500, with particular attention to cross-cultural connections between Byzantium and regions historically marginalized in scholarship. He studies the strategies that ancient and medieval traditions use to flesh out the divine through the careful integration of built space, iconographic programs, ritual actions, and sensorial engagement, with particular attention to the use of light. He has published two important monographs, Manipulating Theophany, Light and Ritual in North Adriatic Architecture, which appeared in 2016, and Between Statues and Icons, Iconic Persons from Antiquity to the Early Middle Ages, which was published last year. Finally, a respondent is Maria Alessia Rossi, who is an art history specialist at the Index of Medieval Art at Princeton University. She is the author of the forthcoming book, Visualizing Christ's Miracles in Late Byzantium, Art, Theology, and Court Culture, which will appear from Cambridge University Press next year. Her research interests include medieval monumental art in the Byzantine and Slavic cultural spheres, and her latest project focuses on healing, water, and art. She is the co-founder, together with Alice Sullivan, of the initiative North of Byzantium and of the digital platform Mapping Eastern Europe. Together with Julia Gerhardt, she is working on a multi-year project titled Connecting Histories, the Princeton and Mount Athos Legacy. I would like to invite Alice and Vladimir to give their paper.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank on behalf of myself and Alice, Rob and Vasileios for the invite, and Alessia for agreeing to engage with our research. And I will proceed with the presentation now. If at any moment there's an issue, please let me know. Light, associated with the divine and recognized since antiquity as a vehicle of theophany, holds an important place in Christian theology and practice. Throughout late antiquity and the Middle Ages, light and its depiction were used to indicate the holiness of a space, person, or object. Religious spaces in particular allowed for a careful orchestration of light effects, both natural and artificial, on various surfaces and spatial settings. We see here the representation of Theodoric's palace in Ravenna, with depictions of the Arian and Catholic cultic complexes. God's favoring of the Arians is shown by the light blue windows that betray the presence of light that is God's presence inside the Arian buildings, while the windows of the Catholic shrines are pitch black. It appears that religious buildings from the 4th to the 17th centuries were designed in relation to moving sunlight in order to direct it in meaningful ways in the interior. The number, location, and size of windows and various lighting devices were used to stress the sacredness of various spaces, images, and objects within churches. Whereas the texture of materials affected the way in which the light coming from windows, lamps, and candles reflected in space, hues were appreciated on a scale of luminosity. Light was also used to draw attention to certain images and individuals during the liturgy. Due to its centrality in Christian theology and its significance in the design and perception of liturgical spaces and ritual, light maintained its importance throughout the Middle Ages in various Christian contexts. Therefore, by studying the lighting conditions alongside other ephemeral facets, we gain a more holistic understanding of the structuring of sacred spaces and the ritual performances staged inside than through the separate or even combined study of architecture, decoration, and ritual. In the early medieval period, in the Latin-speaking West, we see a preference for fine sun rays directed with precision toward important locations during relevant moments. For example, a written source tells us that inside the now lost church at Gravedona on Lake Como, in a 9th century painting of the Adoration of the Magi, sun rays were said to fall on the image of Christ and the gifts brought by the wise men, but not on the other elements in the scene. This was deliberate and meaningful. On the hill towering above Florence, inside the church of San Miniato that we see on the screen, on the summer solstice, the sign of the Cancer in the floor mosaic of the zodiac installed in 1207 is singled out as we see here, an effect that's been related to the feast of St. John on June 24th, so 3 days later, with John being the patron saint of the Tuscan city. Another example, in the Pisa Cathedral, completed in 1118, at noon on March 25th, a fine sun ray falls on an egg-shaped mensola, marking the beginning of the new year according to the Byzantine calendar and the Annunciation. Such illuminations would continue in the West throughout the Middle Ages, as a growing number of studies has revealed. In the Byzantine East, rather than directing individual sun rays, builders continued the late antique practice of using diffuse sunlight, concentrating it in the area of the altar, as evidenced here by the Church of St. Catherine's in the Sinai or in the Catholicum of Decani. A second area where sunlight was concentrated in Byzantine churches was the domes, as exemplified here by the Cora or Atonite Catholica. During the Middle and Late Byzantine periods, as the evolution of church architecture gave rise to new forms, more refined uses of light, both natural and artificial, were developed. Preliminary studies have shown that in Byzantium, various effects were added to complement the main phenomena observable in the sanctuary and dome, which typically impacted the orientation of the churches. The study of light in the Christian tradition has intensified in recent years, revealing the key role it played in the mise-en-scène of the divine and the emergence of various ways in which natural and artificial light were integrated with the architecture, decoration, and rituals proposed in several contexts in both the Latin and Byzantine tradition. From Rupestrian sanctuaries in late antique Spain, as we see on the left-hand side, to the Novgorod, the refined ways of directing attention and establishing the consecrated character of areas, images, or objects have been identified. Within this fascinating diversity, we can discern several main ways in which builders put sunlight to use. The first strategy has the building oriented toward the point where the sun rises or disappears on the horizon on a certain date. In the East, this tended to be the orientation that assured most sunlight in the apse at the hour of the morning service. In the West, more diversity is noted, with several cases being oriented for optimal lighting on the day when the saint to which the church was dedicated was celebrated. In the second strategy, it was the vertical aspect of a building and its openings that were calculated to capture and direct sun rays in certain moments onto iconographic motifs and ritual objects or in the context of celebration. A third strategy is documented for the first time at the Church of the Holy Cross at Pătrăuți Monastery, our case study. This church was built in the Principality of Moldavia in 1487. We call this third strategy moving sunlight, as the sun's movement in the sky and the subsequent progress of sun rays in the interior of the church are used to connect two or more elements symbolically in the architectural structure and the image program of the church. Ascertaining the necessary orientation for strategies 1 and 2 could be made through observation. So the space could have been built, and then over a year they could observe where light falls. But we have several manuscripts and objects that attest to the preservation of the knowledge necessary to calculate in advance both the orientation of the main axis of the church and where the rays projected by the windows would fall. Thus, the study of light brings to the fore not only the integration of the various fixed and ephemeral facets of the experiences staged in medieval spaces, but at times allows us to reverse engineer the design process. The church in Pătrăuți, in particular, showcases, as we will see, features that attest to the use of calculations. And even before the building process began, they had decided the location of certain scenes and the fact that they need to be stressed through sun rays on specific dates. Because of this, Pătrăuți marks a milestone in our understanding of the building process of medieval churches, and in particular on Byzantine ones, whose design, building, and decoration sequence was only assumed. Pătrăuți also takes this story into the post-Byzantine period, bringing attention to the innovations in church building and decoration in a region that developed at the crossroads of tradition, Latin, Greek, and Slavic, but one that was deeply indebted to Byzantium. As we can see on these maps, Moldavia is in a position in between the Latin Catholic world to the north and west, Orthodox Slavs and Muslim Tatars to the east, and Byzantium to the south, recently replaced by the Ottomans. The Genovese colonies on the Black Sea and the commercial routes crossing the Principality to and from the Baltic further extended Moldavia's exposure to people, knowledge, and styles, part of which were integrated in its religious architecture and art. The small church at Pătrăuți, initially the Catholicon of a monastery, is the earliest representative of the Moldavian style to have come down to us unmodified, that is, with the original architecture and a nearly complete iconographic program. This Moldavian style emerged soon after the Principality established its independence in 1352, and it reflects Moldavia's location at the crossroad of several traditions. By the second half of the 15th century, and especially during the reign of John Stephen III, this Moldavian style in church architecture and its decoration developed coherent forms. John Stephen, the prince who commissioned the church at Pătrăuți according to the dedicatory inscription and the votive painting inside, took the throne a few years after the fall of Constantinople in 1453 and proceeded to transform the small polity into a Christian bastion to stall the Ottoman advance west and north. Thus, over the first 3 decades of his long rule, he created a complex system of fortifications both on the margin of his domain and further inland. He engaged the Ottomans in dozens of battles and led a policy of changing alliances in order to maximize support against the Porte, the Tatars, and the Wallachians to the south, who often attacked Moldavia together with the Ottomans. During the last decade of his rule, having reached an advantageous peace accord with the Porte, he turned his attention to ecclesiastical commissions. In this period, John Stephen is said to have commissioned around 40 churches, chapels, and monasteries, several of which survive to this day. The church at Pătrăuți was built at the start of this impressive endeavor, and as such is representative for the group of religious structures built and decorated in the same style and likely by the same masons and artisans. The dedicatory inscription of Pătrăuți, placed in a long rectangular register at the center of the west facade, makes clear that the church was dedicated to the Holy Cross. It was completed in the year 1487 and commissioned by John Stephen. Modest in size, it measures only 17.6 meters in length. Pătrăuți was designed on a three-cone plan consisting of a pronaos with the main entrance at the center of the west facade and the three-cone naos with lateral apses extended to the north and south and the larger eastern apse for the altar. The pronaos is capped by a shallow dome, while a steeple-like dome with windows pointing in the cardinal directions rises over the space of the naos, supported by the so-called oblique arches of a specifically Moldavian design. The three-cone layout of Pătrăuți derives from Byzantine and especially Athonite examples. It is known that John Stephen fostered ongoing contacts with the monastic communities on Mount Athos throughout his reign, providing financial assistance, initiating restoration projects, and gifting precious objects to the monasteries on the Holy Mountain. This interaction certainly had collateral effects, leading to a growing impact of Byzantine spirituality and artistic practices in Moldavia. The mural cycles at Pătrăuți also follow Byzantine models. Furthermore, their quality and the Greek inscriptions point to a workshop from the former regions of the Byzantine Empire, perhaps from Thessaly, since the tombstone of a painter George from Tricala, deceased a couple of decades after Pătrăuți was finished, was found in the region. In addition to George from Tricala, we know that John Stephen's entourage included the local metropolitan Theoptist, the prince's main advisor, who was of Slavic origins and who facilitated the coming to Moldavia of other Slavic clerics from Bulgaria and Serbia upon this region's conquest by the Ottomans. We also have attested the presence of Armenian masons engaged in the previous decades in the erection of fortifications. Finally, we have the tombstone that we see here on the lower hand side. The tombstone of a Baptista de Vesentini, said by the funerary inscription to be Magister in diversis artibus, who had been buried in John Stephen's capital in 1512. The Vesentini name was popular in the area of Vicenza, which in this period was part of the Venetian Republic and was undergoing a process of cultural flourishing that created the context for Palladio to obtain his formation there in the 1520s. Among the diversis artibus of Baptista were maybe architecture and the metal arts, because the figurative arts, textiles, and icon painting in John Stephen's Moldavia followed rather Eastern models, and Baptista's burial inside the church points to him working in the ecclesiastical realm. In the Moldavian churches, the presence of Western architects is shown by the Gothic features of the buildings. At Pătrăuți, these are the portals, the window frames, and the window tracery. The pendant supporting the pronaos dome that we see here on the left, the buttresses, and the roof divided into sections and covered initially with colored tiles in the manner popular in Central European contexts. Furthermore, as we will see later, the precision of the light effects inside the church at Pătrăuți associated with the Western tradition we mentioned in the opening. Thus, it appears that the advance of the Ottomans and John Stephen's ambitious program of ecclesiastical projects brought to the small principality specialists in various facets of Christian experiences, whose collaboration resulted in the eclectic yet coherent style we see here at Pătrăuți, which was then further developed in more complex commissions by John Stephen and his successors, as we can see in these later developments of the style. We can observe on this through the comparison between the plan of Pătrăuți and that of Moldovița, which is dated roughly 50 years later, the evolution along the same lines of liturgical spaces in Moldavia. So by studying Pătrăuți, we get an insight into the beginnings of this process. These spaces reflected Moldavia's new role which had been negotiated over 3 decades of fighting, alliances, and interventions across the Eastern Christian world, in particular on Mount Athos and the 2 other Romanian-speaking regions across the Carpathian mountains, in ways that established the local prince as the defender of Christianity. Even the Pope called him the athlete of Christ because of his role in blocking the Ottomans. John Stephen's ambitions, which Pătrăuți makes clear not only through the obvious integration of Byzantine, Gothic, and Central European elements, but also through the painted decoration and light effects, as we will see, were imperial. In addition to taking the role of defender of orthodoxy left vacant and donor to Mount Athos, he married the Paleologan princess from Mangup and took on the imperial title. The church in Pătrăuți celebrated that marriage, being dedicated to the Holy Cross, the feast on which Stephen married Mary of Mangup. The way in which elements pertaining to distinct traditions were integrated in the design of the church emerges fully when we consider the nature of the light effects documented inside the space, which require the careful coordination of built space, openings, and decoration with the sun's movement in the sky over the day and year, and also with the character of the specific feasts and the content of the liturgies then celebrated. On September 14, the feast of the dedication of the church, the setting sun aligns with the main axis of the church, which is set slightly off the east-west axis, slowly advancing through the pronaos, naos, and templon to perfectly frame the altar. Numerous churches from across the Balkans and the Carpathians, like that of Studenica, for example, have similar deviations of the east-west axis, which precipitated certain light phenomena in their interiors. This effect was not difficult to calculate for John Stephen's architect, since due to the error accumulated by the Julian calendar by that time, 9 days, September 14 overlapped with the autumn equinox in 1487. The solstices and equinoxes were the dates for which throughout the Middle Ages the sun's path could be most easily calculated. In fact, builders had astrolabes with these calculations set to the coordinates of the regions in which they worked, and could determine not only the orientation, but the position and angle of the sun on any given day and hour. And we see here the only surviving Byzantine astrolabe with Greek writing, dated to 1062, set the coordinates of Thessaloniki and brought to Vienna in 1462 by Bessarion. Thus, builders could establish with ease the main axis and adjust accordingly for days before and after the 4 cosmic events of the solstices and equinoxes. At Pătrăuți, the sun's movement through the space was likely showcased to locals on the vigil preceding the feast. At that hour, Vespers is celebrated in the Byzantine tradition, since the hour of the service is not fixed but rather follows the time when the sun sets. The main theme of Vespers is Christ coming into the world as light into darkness. Thus, as various passages announcing the coming of Christ as light were sung and read, those gathered inside could observe the advancing light in the interior toward the altar. As a way to transition to the next section of our presentation, we just want to know that the dedication of Pătrăuți to the Holy Cross is unique in Moldavia at this time and reflects John Stephen's imperial ambitions, since both Byzantine and Western medieval rulers associated themselves with the Holy Cross and Emperor Constantine. This recurrence of Constantine in the iconographic program of the church further strengthens this point, as the founder of New Rome is featured 4 times in the mural program, 3 times with the cross and once with John Stephen.
Wonderful. I'll take it over now, and we'll turn attention to some of the more intricate image cycles of Pătrăuți and how light interacts with the complex mural program. The decorations of the building are indebted to Byzantine iconographic and stylistic patterns, both inside and outside. The Last Judgment, as you can see here from this photograph, takes up the entirety of the west facade, and an icon of Saints Constantine and Helena occupies the tympanum of the main entrance, and this is the only exterior decoration that survives on the building. The interior murals, executed a few years after the church's construction in 1487 and partially repainted toward the end of the 15th century, carry inscriptions in Greek and represent the earliest example of Moldavian monastic church painting. So let's move in the interior. The pronaos displays an image of Christ Pantocrator in the dome above, with a gospel book open to John 8:12, quoting, "I am the light of the world. He that follows me walks not in darkness, but shall have the light of life." So there's this references to light already from the outset, from the entrance to the church. Further down the walls, there are murals of holy martyrs and pious women, a prominent representation of the wedding feast at Cana, and an image directly below it identified as the procession of the soldier saints, or the cavalcade of the holy soldiers, unique in medieval and Byzantine iconography. The mural of the procession, painted in a long horizontal register on the west wall of the pronaos above the main entrance to the church, so visible upon exiting the building, shows a non-biblical scene with Emperor Constantine and the Archangel Michael leading a cavalcade made up of 13 mounted saints rendered in the guise of military saints, soldiers rendered in the guise of military saints. They ride toward a large cross in the sky before them, painted in the upper right corner of the composition. The Greek inscription near the cross states, "In this sign," that is in reference to the cross, "you shall defeat your enemies," recalling the account of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, which marked Constantine's turn to Christianity and subsequent protection of the Christian faith within the Roman Empire. Fighting under the sign of the cross also resonated in the Moldavian context of the 15th century, as the region was repeatedly under threat from neighboring powers, and especially the Ottoman Empire after 1453. This image, thus, was designed to evoke divine assistance in Constantine's 4th century campaign, and by extension in Stephen's 15th century struggles against the Ottomans. The naos was adorned with scenes from the Passion Cycle and images of military saints, as well as a votive painting of the patron and his family, and an icon of Saints Constantine and Helena. The dome, in this case, no longer preserves its painted details, but we might be able to reconstruct the imagery based on other surviving monuments. The sanctuary carries images of bishops and the scenes of the Last Judgment, of the Last Supper, the communion of the apostles, and Christ washing the feet of his apostles. The main image in the apse is now lost, but was likely a monumental Theotokos enthroned with the Christ child among angels, as found in other local churches. And here we reconstructed the decorations of the eastern apse based on the surviving murals at Voronezh Monastery, which was built in 1488, just the year after Pătrăuți. So over the course of the year, sunlight brought elements of the murals in this church to the fore in moments and ways that were liturgically and also politically relevant, indicating their intentional design and character. Let's begin with some examples. In the drum of the dome over the naos, the prophet Isaiah is shown standing. In his right hand, Isaiah holds an open scroll on which the text from Psalm 112:3 is written. "From the sun's rising to its setting, praise the name of the Lord," the text reads. On the longest day of the year, namely the summer solstice, the first sun ray to enter the church at around 5:35 in the morning frames the figure of the prophet. The same manner of framing has been observed in the baptistry in Parma, which was finished in 1270, just to offer one medieval example. There, Manuela Incerti has shown that the figure of Jesus in the scene of the baptism is framed as we see here in the period of Easter, as you can see in the detail, the period of Easter when baptism was celebrated. In both instances, the scenes are in the upper parts of domes and very small, despite the impression given by these photographs. Thus, great precision was necessary in their design and also in the execution. Here's another example. In the vicinity of the iconostasis at Pătrăuți, a wall niche painted with the bust of Saint Auxentius is lit by a sun ray on the day of his feast, on December 13th, which, due to the error of the Julian calendar, was the winter solstice in 1487. As we can see, the light does not focus solely on the interior of the niche, which contains the painted bust portrait of the saint, and likely hosted some kind of religious object or reliquary related to his remains, but extends toward the pavement, substantiating the lower body of Saint Auxentius. A similar effect was achieved in a more complex manner in the Catholicon of Hosios Lucas. Andrei Piotrowski has shown how the spaces flanking the presbytery of the Catholicon fill with sunlight thanks to their orientation and windows, which radiates then toward the naos through thin marble slabs. Two of these slabs extend the figures of the saints, Athanasius and Gregory of Nazianzus. Another relevant example from Pătrăuți occurs on June 24th, the feast of St. John, whose name John Stephen bore. On this day, a sunray is used to make a different kind of visual and theological statement. The light comes in from the steeple-like dome above the naos, whose narrow windows are carefully positioned and oriented in the cardinal directions. Between roughly 11 and 11:40 in the morning, thus at the hour when the Eucharistic liturgy was typically celebrated, the sun, descending now almost vertically through the south window of the dome, sends a ray onto the scene of Christ's descent into hell, depicted on the north wall of the naos, and it's here marked on the left. The fresco shows the Anastasis using an older iconography. Rather than pulling both Adam and Eve from their graves, or just Adam with one hand while holding a cross staff with the other, in what had become the classic Byzantine representation of the scene, the Christ in the Anastasis at Pătrăuți follows a much earlier medieval formula. He is shown lifting Adam with his right hand while holding a scroll in his left. Rather than illuminating the scene generally, the sun ray underlines visually three of its key details. First, it stops on the face of Adam, stressing his hopeful gaze absorbed by the standing figure of Christ before him. The light then travels to the joined hands of Adam and Christ, the electric moment when man and God meet again and humanity is allowed back into heaven is thus visually underscored. Eventually, as the ray grows thinner and more precise before disappearing altogether, it focuses on the left hand of Christ holding the scroll that announced his second coming. The movement amounted to a visual discourse, which the priest would have certainly pointed out and enriched with theological considerations, possibly connected to Moldavia's state as a small Christian polity resisting immense pressure from neighboring forces, and especially the Ottomans. On the one hand, since the Eastern Christians awaited the second coming to take place in the year 7000 according to the Byzantine calendar, which corresponded to the year 1492, and thus shortly after the murals were finished in this church, the effect would have reinforced the Moldavians' resilience and strengthened the promise of Christ's return. John Stephen, on the other hand, was also building a dynasty, so his sight was on a longer period, as we will see. All of these light effects at Pătrăuți could have been realized by constructing the church and observing over the following years, while the building settled and the decorative program was determined, where light falls on specific dates and choosing appropriate models. However, the recurrence of effects on the solstices and equinoxes indicates that they could have also been calculated in advance. This aspect is attested by what is perhaps the most impressive light effect identified so far, which reveals that at least some of the scenes painted inside were established before the building process began. As we mentioned, John Stephen was betting on the world enduring after 1492, as shown by the votive painting and also its broader context. The final light effect we will discuss occurs on the same day as the one on the Anastasis on the opposite wall, and that is June 24th, the feast of Moldavia's patron St. John. On the south wall, opposite the Anastasis, John Stephen had himself depicted with his family in a votive painting. shown holding the model of the church in Pătrăuți, Stephen is introduced to Christ via the intercessory role of Constantine. And Constantine is present here in part because the church is dedicated to the Holy Cross. In other contexts, we have the saint represented to whom the church is dedicated. Early in the morning, a sun ray entering the church from the only window in the apse falls at the base of the votive painting under the patron's image, and then proceeds to descend to the floor and make its way toward the altar table in a little over 3 hours. In this video, the effect is slightly altered by the presence of a later templon, but we can still trace this impressive path. The light eventually reaches and rests on the altar table, not in the center, which belongs to Christ, but on the side. Thus, it would appear that the patron had his presence fleshed out on his name day inside the church. The medium of the substantiation, namely the same light that fleshed out the presence of Christ and various saints inside the same space, stressed the consecrated character of the ruler and his descendants, represented with him in the votive painting. In order for this light effect to be possible, the window in the apse was deliberately placed off axis, and its sills given a slightly different profile. Since all other windows and niches in the church are perpendicular and aligned, the position of this altar window appears intentional from the beginning. Investigations realized during the recent restoration campaign revealed that the window was built like this from the outset, which means that the effect was part of the initial planning of the church. And the architect had discussed with the patron, and likely his advisor, the nature of the scene, the date, and the anticipated light effect, so all going hand in hand. The need to have this effect, and the one we saw happening on September 14th in the afternoon, and perhaps the profile of the landscape toward the east to where a low hill rises, forced the architect to choose a particular position and shape of the main eastern window of the church. Interestingly, similar off-axis apse windows are attested in several medieval churches, with their full effects still awaiting investigation. In one case, in the church of San Ambrogio alla Riena near Salerno, the position of the apse was connected with the desire to have a sunray frame a scene on the north wall of the church in a liturgically relevant context. However, since the decoration of the nave walls is now lost at Vienna, with only the apse preserving the original murals, the case is less certain than at Pătrăuți. So we're unable to connect in this context aspects of the architecture, the decoration ritual, and the light, as we can with Pătrăuți. The political implications of the light phenomenon indicate, we believe, the purpose of Pătrăuți and likely other churches commissioned by John Stephen, namely the establishing of his rule as divinely sanctioned and the reinforcement of Moldavia's faith in order to continue to resist the Ottomans and other threats, as most of the other Orthodox polities in Eastern Europe had fallen. The light effects preserved here at Pătrăuți were initially documented with photography by Father Gabriel din Uherea over several years while he served as priest at this parish. We are continuing his work through a systematic analysis that involves several axes of research. First, we seek to identify and update information on other uses of sunlight in late antique and medieval churches in order to place Pătrăuți in context and also identify its debt to various local building traditions. And to this end, we published the volume on natural light in medieval churches, the cover of which is here on the screen. Second, we verify the accuracy of the documented effects by creating a digital model of the church and running simulations that integrate aspects such as the sun's changing position over the centuries, changes in the liturgical calendar, and surrounding landscape profile. We built the model from a laser scan of the interior, which gives the precise sizes and inclinations of the openings that directed the sunlight, thus allowing us to check the implications of these effects and to search for the existence of others, starting with the main feasts and those locally relevant. As you can see here, for example, a simulation of the light's projection on June 24th that we just discussed used to confirm that what is now observed inside retains its relevance when the parameters belonging to the original monument are integrated, such as minor changes in cosmic position of the sun or changes in the calendar. And here, interestingly, the simulation reveals a much more dynamic path to this moving sunlight, especially around the altar, which the photography alone did not capture in full. So comparing how the light kind of circles around the altar through the simulation in comparison to the video that we showed you earlier is quite striking. The model allows us to further integrate other relevant aspects, such as lost or altered liturgical furnishings and original materials closing the windows, to check if the effects continue to manifest and how they do so. The project, as it develops, will also allow us to consider further the relationships between light, surface textures and chromatic, depicted scenes, the liturgical schedule, the content of ritual utterances, and other ephemeral aspects such as incense, smoke, the location and effect of artificial lighting devices, and dynamic facets such as the person's movement through the spaces of the church. Due to its small scale, excellent state of preservation, abundant contemporaneous data, and the light effects that tie space, decoration, and ritual together, the Church of Pătrăuți encourages the reconstruction of the daily and yearly experiential cycles unique to it. As the sun's position in the sky over the year revealed changing aspects of the interior, Pătrăuți and increasingly more medieval sites are being shown to relate to the celebrated feasts. Our research thus will produce a model analysis of similar cycles that characterize medieval churches. For this, the digital reconstruction of the church is essential, since year-long study of the monument in situ is virtually impossible. And over the centuries, most churches also underwent changes that we can correct digitally, such as the transparency of windows or the presence of furnishings and objects that have been changed. And we made this point previously, but even if we were to be able to undertake on-site research year-round throughout the year, we cannot guarantee sunny days to be able to study this phenomenon. Given the positioning of the church at the crossroads of traditions, the results of this research will bring forward not only the subsequent churches built in the Moldavian style, but other aspects of religious sites from across Eastern Europe in the post-Byzantine period and other traditions as well. We hope the analysis of this church, soon to be concluded, will mark a milestone in our understanding of Christian religious spaces throughout the liturgical year, while serving as a model for the integrated study of fixed and ephemeral facets, especially natural and artificial light, in the design and use of sacred spaces. The use of digital instruments also allows us to test and recover effects that would otherwise remain lost. So to date, aspects of this research have appeared in Gesta, the volume on natural light, which we mentioned earlier, published in 2023, a forthcoming complementing volume on artificial light in medieval churches that is currently in peer review, and a co-authored book currently in progress, in addition to shorter and more accessible contributions to online platforms on the Church of Pătrăuți. We've written short entries for mapping Eastern Europe and also for smart history. Although small and pertaining to a culture on the margins, the Church of Pătrăuți has a lot to teach us, and we invite you to follow the progress and results of this research on the webpage we created for the project, hosted through Tufts University, where you can find information about the building, the historical information, details, an image archive detailing the various mural cycles, new plans that we've made and elevations, as well as aspects of our ongoing study of the 3D model that helps us simulate and examine the light effects in the interior, in addition to a resources page. So on that note, we thank you for your attention, and we hope you will continue to follow this work.
Okay, thank you so much, Vladimir. And can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So thank you, as I was saying, Vladimir and Alice, for such a rich and fascinating lecture. We learned so much about the use and importance of light in sacred spaces and how it could be mastered in different ways to express deliberate and meaningful ideas. You also brought to the fore this little known area of the medieval world, the Principality of Moldavia, and showcased how by gathering Armenian, Byzantine, and Western artisans, masons, painters, and architects, it stood at the crossroads of different traditions. You prompted us to think about how architecture, monumental painting, lighting devices, and the location of a monument had to be thought of as an ensemble, discarding preconceived notions of what came first and instead allowing us to approach buildings in a more holistic manner. Finally, the use of 3D models, photographs, and digital reconstructions allow us to access information that might not be visible today, correcting changes made in time to the structure of the monument, or integrating lost or altered liturgical furnishings and original materials. So I'm going to just jump in and start asking you questions because the material is so interesting, and I'm sure our audience also would have liked to ask. So I'll take the opportunity and start. So let me start from this final aspect of your talk that I just mentioned, and with a big picture question. Could you expand on the broader implications of using Pătrăuți as a case study for other medieval monuments? What are the limits and challenges of the framework and methods you have used, such as laser scan technology, photography, and 3D reconstructions?
Thank you very much, Alessia. I'll take this first one. It's a very good question, that of the relevance of Pătrăuți, because we propose it as a model for medieval spaces in general, and yet we chose a model that is so in such a liminal context. But the complex way of approaching medieval spaces that we propose, which considers several facets of the mise-en-scène, both fixed and dynamic, and the evolving experiential profile of the spaces throughout the day, but also throughout the year, as the sun's path and intensity changes, as the nature of the celebrated liturgical event changes the focus and the meaning of the space, and also the position of and number of the artificial lights, which we know in the Byzantine tradition was shifting with the nature of the celebration. This integration of all the aspects together with the light and the nature of the celebrations requires a manageable space in order to develop, right? Because there are so many elements to integrate, and we're doing this for the first time, it is ideal to start this and to try this out on a small, manageable space. And in this case, Pătrăuți, in this sense, Pătrăuți is ideal because it preserves the initial architecture and decoration, as well as the topography, which in many cases has changed and blocks certain phenomena. It's relevant to a whole local style, as we have seen. It's placed at the beginning of this new phase of the Moldavian style. And because of its location at the intersection of tradition, it is also relevant for knowledge transfer patterns across the region. As for the second part of your question regarding the limits and challenges, I will let Alice take that. Thank you.
Sure. So just like any building that we're studying from the past and or any context, there are certainly limitations. There isn't a balanced basis of information for all the elements that we need to study. In the case of Pătrăuți, we certainly have missing historical data. Some of the mural cycles details that we noted have to be reconstructed from other contexts. But we can gather the missing data from the 3D model, which can help us reconstruct aspects that have been lost, to study the building, but also from contemporary monuments. So for Pătrăuți, the model helps us study light conditions throughout the liturgical year, which we cannot be done in situ. They can help us simulate in the interior aspects of lost furnishings, like we can reconstruct the original templon, for example. And then the contemporary monuments, of which we have 3 in total, in addition to Pătrăuți, offer additional information. So at the time that Pătrăuți was built, another church was also built. Unfortunately, it has been destroyed, but 2 others were built in 1488 that have been preserved. Unfortunately, one has been transformed by the addition of an exonarthex, but the interior of the naos and the pronaos remain stable. And the final one, the city of Suceava grew around it. So the topography is not quite the same. So some of the light effects are not evident. But these monuments and their the surviving historical data can help us illuminate aspects of Pătrăuți that we don't have in full.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really like a unique case study in many senses, Pătrăuți. So connected to this question, you mentioned in a couple of instances the importance of ephemeral facets of sacred spaces. So how could ephemerality help us understand the structuring of sacred spaces and the ritual performances staged within the building? Could you comment on this a bit further?
Sure, certainly. I'm happy to take this. So in recent years, we know that there has been an increasing interest in the study of ephemeral facets, aspects of sacred spaces in both the Byzantine East and also the Latin West, including aspects of movement in the context of ritual performances in the interior and also on the outside of religious buildings, smells, sounds, and music that scholars are trying to recreate. With our project on Pătrăuți, we bring into the discussion the complex uses of natural and also artificial light conditions with implications for visibility, symbolism, movement of objects such as curtains and people in the space, as well as the content of ritual utterances. So in a sense, the study of light helps bring together all of these other elements that are fixed and also ephemeral in the study of sacred spaces. With Pătrăuți, we're also able to study and analyze the light conditions so as to better understand how this aspect of ephemerality contributed to the design, building, and also the use of the church in the second half of the 15th century, but also through the model, we can extend the study into the present. And as we mentioned, the study of light goes very much hand in hand with the study of other fixed and ephemeral facets of this space. And the model of study, to finally add, that we're putting forth with the Church of Pătrăuți and the light phenomena detailed within, we hope will encourage future work on light conditions in other sacred spaces, both East and West, as well as the integration of light with other ephemeral and concrete elements in the study of sacred spaces. So considering how they were designed, constructed, and used over time, especially within the Eastern European context, but perhaps also returning to churches that are more well-known in the Byzantine and Western medieval contexts. So we see light as a connecting thread in studies of ephemerality.
Thank you. So now thinking of participating in this light effects, you showed us so well these different effects within the Church of Pătrăuți. Can you connect that to the ideal viewer? You mentioned how for Vespers, those who gathered would be able to observe the advancing light in the interior and then toward the altar. Would these be exclusively monks? Do you imagine the audience knowing where to look, or would they be surprised as they are guided, as you suggested, by the priest to look for these lighting effects? And finally, how would a crowd in the space change the experience of the viewer? I'm thinking of Stephen's portrait. If someone were standing by it, would they in some ways participate and partake in the lighting effects?
I'll take this one. Thank you very much. First, regarding this ideal viewer, because we have theological interpretations of Byzantine church space and rituals, we have been operating with this sort of panoptic view of what they mean. And that is a perspective that we can associate with an erudite person who understood the full range of symbolic connotations. And obviously, the experiences afforded by these spaces differed based on the background and knowledge of the person. Right, and so I think it's a desideratum in Byzantine liturgical studies to move from this sort of ideal view of what the ritual and the spaces meant to the diversity that was closer to the historical reality, most likely. And Pătrăuți forces us in that direction because the liturgies were in Slavonic and because the images had texts in Greek, right? So it forces us to consider the mediatory role of the clergy or the local personnel who had to have explained and in the process stressed the relevance of the images, their connection to the nature of the celebrated feasts, and of course the light effects would also fall into this, let's say, didactic dimension. The monastery was a nunnery, but it was placed next to a village. So we have to imagine a mixed audience, especially for the feasts, when it's likely that people from other villages in the area would have joined and maybe remained after the celebration for a feast. Let's say a lunch given by the monastery, it was often the case. And if we consider that it's only roughly 10 kilometers away from John Stephen's capital, I think we should expect that at least for the Feast of the Holy Cross, members of the court would be present. We assume that the relic of the true cross was present in the church, so that could have certainly attracted this audience on that specific day. So there are various categories of audience that we can whose presence we can establish inside the space, and we're trying in parallel to identifying the let's say the symbolic levels of the experience offered inside, to also consider how they pair with the let's say understanding level of these main categories of believers. Finally, regarding interaction with the light effects, obviously it's important, especially with the light effects that are documented on the floor level, right? That you share the same space with. And I think we should imagine people making room for them, right? Just as they moved to make room for the deacon, for the reader, or the priest during the various liturgical movements, I think we should imagine that they were instructed by the personnel to make room so that this moving sun rays would become more visible. And I think that in the act of crowding themselves, because the space is quite small, in order for them to make room for this and to observe it, it would have stressed the feeling that they are sharing this space with an immaterial but visible presence of the divine. So I think it played into this confirmation that John Stephen was looking for due to the political context, that God is there with them and it's supporting their faith and it's supporting their resistance to the Ottomans ultimately. Thank you.
I really like this idea. And out of curiosity, do we know of John Stephen ever traveling to Pătrăuți or visiting? Do we have any documents?
Alice?
We have evidence that he left for some major battles from the church.
Okay.
And so in my analysis of the painting of the procession of the soldier scenes is the last image that we can imagine his soldiers seeing going into battle. That would have been a very important. site.
And it would reinforce this whole idea of presence in the absence. That's why it would just really trigger this idea that, you know, with his portrait and with the soldiers, it could really fit very nicely. Okay, so this is a very specific question, but I was struck by the division between Eastern and Western traditions in the way light was used. At the beginning of the lecture, you gave us some examples from Italy, like Pisa, and then compare them to case studies like Hagia Sophia or Mount Athos. Could you elaborate on this? Do you have a sense of why there is this divide and why so early on?
Thank you. We don't have a definitive answer. It might ultimately be a matter of preference, but there is a climatic, let's say, phenomenon that can be related to it. In the early Middle Ages, the Western provinces enter a little ice age, they're called. It's called the Vandal minimum. So there is a general decrease of overall temperatures, which has been connected with the, let's say, decreasing number also of openings in churches. So less windows, less doors. And with this, the growing darkness of interiors of medieval Latin churches in this period. Now, if you have less windows, the effect of the few that you have left is obviously more obvious and more imposing, and it might have derived from that since we do have these only 2 or 3 sources of natural light, let's try to connect them in a meaningful sense, because unlike diffused light of latent thick spaces, we have these sources that are cutting through the overall obscurity of the naves now. There is something parallel that seems to happen in the same period with artificial lighting in spaces in the West, where with the difficulties of producing glass and of obtaining beeswax in the early Middle Ages, olive oil was easier to get, but also that gets more expensive. The overall, let's say, growing obscurity of the space allows them, as we can see with the windows, to stress the sanctity of certain areas and moments through the use of less artificial light, right? That became very expensive. So now you can achieve, this is the thesis of Daniela Mondini, you can achieve the effect of stressing the sanctity and directing the attention of the viewer to certain moments or places in the space with 3 candles, what in a late antique basilica you would need 25, right? So there is this overall darkening of the interiors that we can maybe connect to the Vandal minimum. And then we start seeing these changes in how they use natural and artificial light. But we couldn't find it written black on white why they prefer this type of mise-en-scène. Thank you.
No, that makes sense. So there's sometimes there's no answer, but thank you so much for, I mean, the context gives us the answer in some ways. So connected to this East-West dichotomy, the example of Pătrăuți is so fascinating because, as you well demonstrated, Stephen gathered an ensemble of Christian specialists, so artists, masons, architects, printers, and he took on this role of defender of orthodoxy against the Ottoman advance. But I was thinking, sometimes reality, and a lot of the times it's a lot more porous than this. So could we at all envisage artisans from the Ottoman Empire sharing the knowledge and expertise too? Could there be a Muslim component to our understanding of lighting effects? Could this be a future avenue of research? How do you think of this, or if at all this could be considered for the case of Pătrăuți?
Yeah, I'll take this one. I think it's a very good and important question, and certainly something that we could look into as we continue this research. What I can say for now is that the Ottoman presence in the region is certainly evident, beginning in the 15th century and on. But during the second half of the 15th century, in Stephen's time, this presence was mainly in the context of clashes and conflicts as the Ottoman Empire was expanding and gradually conquering regions of the Balkans and the Carpathians. So we know of numerous battles that Stephen engaged with. So the relations were mostly adversary, and we don't have evidence of actual artists or thinkers from the Ottoman context interacting at the Moldavian court. We begin to see a more sustained and direct Ottoman presence and its inflection in the visual culture of Moldavia beginning around the middle of the 16th century and from there on. And by the early 17th century, we have even architectural projects like the Church of the Three Hierarchs in Iași that is built in a Moldavian tradition, but that displays a completely different visual idiom. So instead of having painted figurative exterior decorations, we have sculpted vegetal and ornamental geometric motifs. So some have argued that the presence of different traditions is very much at play here in the building of this one church. And related to this aspect of mediation of knowledge and expertise in the Moldavian context, we should also like to add that after the fall of Constantinople, and this Pătrăuți makes this very clear, we have the documented presence in Moldavia of artists from former Byzantine lands working at the Moldavian court. So the contact with Byzantium is very much direct. A little later, the mediation of Byzantine models takes place also through regions of the Balkans, Serbia and Bulgaria. And then interestingly, by the second half of the 16th century, we also have we can also identify a mediation of Byzantine traditions through northern centers like Kyiv. So there are these contacts. So the story is really quite complex, and it's important to look at the evidence that we have, but also to try to interpret what we see in the visual production, the architectural and the visual production of the region.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think I'm keeping track of the time. So maybe just one final question. And I think this will be no surprise. This is tied to my work and my work with Alice in mapping and bringing to the fore Eastern Europe. Pătrăuți, as you said, it is at the so-called margins, and probably a few years ago it would have been considered peripheral. Hopefully by now we are starting to include this material more and more. But as you said, it showcases the importance of Eastern Europe and other lesser known parts of the medieval world where Byzantine, medieval, in this case Gothic, Central European models were carefully integrated with local elements. So could you talk a bit more about this aspect, and specifically what are the challenges of this kind of material when it comes to disciplinary frameworks and temporal, geographical categories like Byzantine, medieval, post-Byzantine? Thank you.
Thank you for this very complex question. The case of Pătrăuți is both typical and special, and it certainly challenges aspects of what constitutes established disciplinary frameworks and categories, as you said. It's typical for a border region that border between brackets that developed its art at the crossroads of tradition. Like much of the architecture and visual culture of Eastern Europe, it doesn't really fall neatly into one category or another. Pătrăuți in particular demonstrates that nothing is really peripheral in this context, but rather there's an aspect of centrality of Moldavia and cultural exchanges. So if you look at it from within its own logic, which is a dynamic that characterized other regions in this space in other moments of history, for example, the Studenica context. So our map of the medieval world, in a sense, would place Eastern Europe at the center of contacts and exchanges, in contrast to how Europe is often mapped. Pătrăuți is also special because it's a well-preserved case that demonstrates aspects of cultural negotiation, the intertwining of knowledge, as we have seen, and also the ingenuity evident in such local contexts. And the site helps us expand aspects of geographical, temporal, and theoretical parameters in the study of medieval art in general, I think, because, for example, geographically, it takes the story of the Gothic and Byzantine architecture beyond the Carpathian Mountains. Temporally, it shows that the second half of the 15th century, which we call post-Byzantine, it's a moment of continuation and flexibility of Byzantine tradition. So basically it demonstrates the dynamic character of late and post-Byzantine religious art. There's nothing inferior or in decline here, in a sense. And finally, with regards to how it contributes to theory, the study of Pătrăuți offers a model for how we could continue to study sacred spaces, the building sequences, to what to look for, how collaborations might have went, and aspects of cultural contact in more integrated manner. This, what we develop here, will not overlap with one-to-one with other cases, but it is a model of how to do that, and it is developed at a level that's up to date, unprecedented in terms of the number of facets that we're taking into account.
Yeah, and I would also add that as a way forward, Pătrăuți underscores how exciting the artistic and architectural production of Eastern Europe could be, and that's something that we've been pushing for quite some time in other contexts, Alessia and I, because of the limited access to this region, both physical and ideological, for much of the 20th century, and until relatively recently, expanding access to this material through digital initiatives, we think is crucial. And in the sense, the Pătrăuți website that we set up was specifically designed as a way to access the key research and our efforts and our results as this project develops, but also make available material that might not be able to make it in a more traditional publication. So we can offer videos and simulations on the website that could complement the traditional mode of publishing this material. And on a much larger scale, I would say public-facing scholarly efforts like our North of Byzantium project and the Mapping Eastern Europe website make knowledge about the history, visual culture, and ongoing research and also outreach across Eastern Europe available to everyone. So we feel that a way to explore these resources through more traditional academic publishing, but also through accessible content is key. So a way forward is through these public-facing scholarly efforts that complement traditional academic research and publications.
Thank you, and thank you for responding to my many questions. Thank you for a fantastic lecture, and I will wait for...
Thank you for the challenging questions.
Thank you for presiding.
So this is the time I come in. And, thank the three of you for this really fascinating presentation this afternoon for me. It's wonderful to see collaboration enacted here with no concern for the practicalities of academic life and who gets credit for this or that. But basically, we're seeing highly successful teamwork here, exploring very difficult problems. And Vladimir mentioned and Alice mentioned how with these digital models, you're able to incorporate large numbers of variables that people heretofore have not begun to think about. It's I think it's amazing how you're doing this, and it also very interesting how the work on this particular church began with the local priest, demonstrating in some ways a kind of paradigm for medieval research that's gone on since the 19th century. Local antiquarians, as they're called in France, would begin to assemble things and assemble documents, etc. And then what we academics would call more professional scholars would come in and reinterpret these and make it what the professional scholars think is more proper academic work. It's all useful, all of these people, all of these perspectives. My computer is frozen a little bit, so I'm at a loss to give you the particulars of our next lecture, but here goes from memory. You'll find it on the website. Our next lecture is on January 17 by Ioana Rapti, who is a professor at the École des Hautes Études in Paris. Ioana will be our first repeat as a lecturer in our series, which came about because she came to New Haven to see an Armenian manuscript at Yale University. And this relates to her larger interest in 14th century Armenian illumination. And I thought it was quite relevant, the research, and especially relevant to Yale University. So we have invited her back, and I encourage everybody to return on January 17. In the meantime, there's Christmas, there's New Year's. Have a good time, celebrate, don't eat and drink too much, and we'll see you in the new year. Okay? Bye-bye.